I'm John Siegenthaler once again. Welcome to A Word on Words. When Whites Riot, that's what we're talking about today. That's the new book of Shelia Smith Mc Koy. Welcome to A Word on Words.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you here to talk about when Whites riot. I say it's good to have you here to talk about a subject that's very, very painful for a lot of people. And the book, I will tell you, can be painful to read. Let's begin by talking about our images of riots. And you deal quite candidly with how some people say one thing and they mean something else. White riot means one thing, black riot means something else, and it really depends on who's speaking and who's listening.
That's true. And as you said, it is a very painful book to read. It's not your typical coffee table book because it does talk about something that sort of hits at the core of American life and South African life indeed, and something that we continue to come back to, though somewhat unwittingly. We wonder why we always come back to racial violence. And so I wanted to look at this idea of white riot specifically because in America and indeed in South Africa, when people think of riot, they don't think of anything having to do with people who are a part of polite society. They think about black and other bodies of color in violent disorder. They don't think about what precipitates these events or indeed the ways in which white people have been a part of these things that have been called race riots through time. So I really wanted to look at this idea of racial violence through that lens because I really think that's the only way we're going to be able to understand how indeed we're going to stop racial violence in this country.
I don't know if it's possible for the, we have a cover of your book and I saw it on the screen a moment ago. It's up there again. If the camera could just hone in a little bit, I guess maybe not. That's the Detroit race riot of what year?
1943.
Let's begin, because that's on the cover, talking a little bit about the race riot of 1943 in Detroit, Michigan.
Okay. Well, I selected that particular image because it's one of the few images that we can actually access that typically will show white involvement in such a thing as race riot in a way that the ordinary reader might be able to understand.
And you can see as you look at it, there are some African Americans fleeing a white mob across in front of a bus.
And downtown, in public, in broad daylight.
Absolutely.
And nothing was really done to stop the crowd. This is a riot that, like most, got completely out of hand, and the press was deeply engaged in this issue. Interestingly enough, though, it's one in which at least there were misdemeanor violations put upon white citizens who were involved in the riot. The black citizens received the bulk of the citations as regard to it. But Detroit has been a particular center for racial violence, as has Los Angeles, as has many places in the United States. And so I wanted to center on that image because it was really one that was a visible proof that, here we have an example of these white bodies in violent disorder. What exactly does it mean, and how does that shift our understanding of what takes place when racial violence breaks out?
There's a point in the book when you cite Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. You say the Invisible Man discovers a white race riot, and I thought your selections of people you rely on to define this phenomenon, Ellison, John Hope Franklin, and others. But Ellison, I thought, was particularly compelling. Why'd you select that passage?
Well, Invisible Man is one of my favorite books, and I am a lover of literature, a PhD in English, so of course I wanted to look at the ways in which literature in particular can tell a story that can't always be told in the press or even on the news. It has a way of bringing in all the societal, all the historical, all the personal elements that go into making such an event. And in particular, The Invisible Man is such a provocative book, in that we have a black character who is insisting on the fact that his black invisible body is really invisible. Nobody ever really sees him. And part of what he has to go through in this process of becoming uninvisible is to understand the ways in which he is seen by white people who are involved in him. And this character, the Invisible Man, is a part of a larger group, a multiracial group that's supposedly aimed at resolving America's racial crises. But what he indeed finds is that he's been a part and parcel to a riot that seemingly just suddenly erupts, but which was in fact planned and carried out very specifically by these very people who suggested that they could do something to resolve the racial situation.
Let me ask you about the juxtaposition of white riots in the United States and white riots in South Africa. You told me that this was really a thesis of yours. When you approach the subject, I'm fascinated by what led you into discussion of this subject. What was it, and how did you initially approach the idea, the parallels between the riots in South Africa and the riots in the United States?
Okay. This was a very long journey for me. I began my career in terms of my dissertation project, trying to find something that would be worthwhile in terms of the time that I'd have to spend with it, and also something that would really do something to perhaps adjust the world's view of how race works in the United States in particular. I remembered, though, many instances of my life where race sort of intervened and connected with this idea of violence. When I was in high school in the 1970s, I'm dating myself there,
Right.
We had Black History Week.
Well, I'm not going to, because
You might go a little bit farther
that's
back.
right. Yeah, only about 100 years.
Well, in the 70s, we had Black History Week. And I vividly remember trying to decorate the one building we were allowed to decorate for Black History Week, and having our things torn down repeatedly. And so there was a moment at which there were high tensions in our high school, and it was reported as a race riot. This was my experience as a high schooler. I happened to graduate high school in 1976, our bicentennial year. And if you'll recall, there was a good deal of publicity around the ways in which this generation was going to really change the world. But in June of '76, as I was graduating and thinking about what my life was going to be like beyond high school, across the waters in South Africa, I see this report where students my age and younger were being shot down in the streets, simply because they didn't want to be pigeonholed into this idea of servitude for the rest of their lives. And so it's an idea that percolated in my mind a good deal, because the U.S. has often used South Africa as an excuse for our own racial woes. It's this way here, and we could probably do better, but at least we're not as bad as things are in South Africa. So part of what I set out to do in this endeavor was to have a look-see in terms of the ways in which the U.S. policies on race and racial practice actually are quite similar to those that took place in South Africa in many, many ways. In fact, part of what I discovered was that as they were trying to put into place this 1948, when apartheid became law, what they did was to look to the segregated U.S. to see what they could do to mirror the situation and make it work in their favor. So in many ways, we have used each other as countries and societies to sort of figure out our cultural take on race. But in the United States, we've always used South Africa as an excuse.
Now, you focus in a number of places in the book, you focus on Stephen Biko.
Mm-hmm.
And Stephen Biko is a figure virtually unknown to most people in America. If you mention Emmett Till, many people will remember that Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy who was brutalized and then murdered by two white men in Mississippi who were outraged because they thought this 14-year-old boy had insulted one of their wives.
And that insult might have been a whistle or a smile. Yeah. We don't even know what it was at this point.
And I remember that case because there came a time when Emmett Till's murderers, after being acquitted by a white jury in Money, Mississippi, they then were paid money by a national magazine, in effect, to confess, to admit what they had done, and it was some small amount of money, maybe $2,000, and there was a great national uproar. The country's conscience suddenly was pricked. I mentioned Emmett Till because Stephen Biko's case, in some ways, I think of him as the Martin Luther King of South Africa, although Mandela was his colleague and his friend. But you know, I remember when the British finally decided they were going to look at Biko's murder in prison, and our country was not gripped by that, but most of Europe was really horrified.
Right, they were fascinated by it.
By the murder of Stephen Biko inside prison. And so I think the analogies are there. I mean, I've drawn on one that maybe is not as poignant as your comparison of the parallels between the riots, but it all comes from rage.
Right.
Talk a little bit, because you write about it, talk about what is it that is the spark that stimulates the rage that results in whites rioting against blacks.
Okay. Well, let me go back a little bit before I do that.
Sure.
And think about your comparison of Emmett Till as a 14-year-old. The first South African who was killed in the uprising in Soweto was a 13-year-old, Hector Peterson.
Exactly.
And it was that photograph that actually was picked up by the AP Wire Service, and it showed the world exactly what was going on in Soweto. And indeed, you might also look at Stephen Biko in terms of his black consciousness mindset. In many ways, quite similar to Malcolm X's literature, indeed, trying to figure out how, as a community, you can learn to love yourself, learn to support yourself, to contradict all these negative images that grow out of society when race is the central issue. What I tried to do was to look at what precipitates these riot events. And I looked at a range of things, beginning in 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina, and ending up basically at the election riots, the pre-election riots in 1994 in South Africa. And I found a set of similar circumstances in each event. We had a very racially stratified society in each of these events. We had a particular point at which this hierarchy was being challenged. In 1898 in Wilmington, for instance, there was, for the first time, a non-democratic ticket in office. The Fusion Party had won, and for the first time we had black public officials in that area, and there was just a pouring out of why this was completely wrong, and America is not a black man's, a Negro state. We had to fight this. In South Africa, indeed, it was that desire to hold on to apartheid practice when it had obviously outlived its usefulness. So you begin with this crisis on top of this racially stratified society. And what happens, and what I call it in the book, is white racialized ululation. Now, ululation is a hard word to say.
It is, that's right.
If you say it 10 times, it'll be your own. But also, I wanted to use a term that had been applied to African cultures to critique what was going on in this Western mindset. Ululation is what happens at a moment of an extreme outpouring of emotion. You will often hear it from women at the Wailing Wall. You will often hear it in the midst of a storm. I won't try to do it very loudly today, but it's a repeating call. Woo! That's ululation. What happens in white racialized ululation is that the press becomes involved in increasing this feeling of loss, that we have to maintain the status quo, this uncertainty that's going to happen if race isn't paramount and handled in the same way that it is at this particular moment. And so people are in a fury to maintain this. Oftentimes, you'll find that it's usually the most economically disempowered in terms of the white involvement in these riots, who are embracing their sense of whiteness by showing that they can brutalize these other people, that they can be white enough to overcome this situation.
For those of you just tuning in, we're talking with Shelia Smith Mc Koy about her new book, When Whites Riot. And the title of the book is one that is going to strike people as odd. We think of race riots, but we don't think of white riots. But if you analyze riots in this country and South Africa, it is not unusual that it is that white rage that boils over some triggering incident, or my guess is that at times it may just be a smoldering fear and dissatisfaction because of economic conditions or economic downturns. Although if you look at the situation in South Africa, the least challenge would create the trigger mechanism that caused what's documented as a riot. Now, you quote John Hope Franklin as sort of using lynching and riot not as synonymous, but close. Talk about his view of that, because it seems to me to be, for all the years of my life, I've known about this phenomenon, lynching. Again, if you look at the crowds of people around those vulgar, vicious photographs of
even children, even women
being lynched,
yes,
and here are these even women and children in those crowds, you know that lynching had a very close relationship to the sort of riot that you see on the front cover of your book. I mean, it's a different scene, a different setting.
But the same root causes and for the same purposes.
That's right, and the same rage that drives it.
Professor Franklin deals with the ways in which lynching and indeed later racial violence were used to maintain a racial status quo. And indeed, if you look at the particular events that I surmise, and I often talk about lynching in regard to that as well, they're public events. And they're meant to be ways in which you can coalesce this idea of whiteness at the same time that you can reinforce this idea of white privilege and white power. Many of these lynchings took place. They were planned events. Children were there. Food was served. It was not the secret kind of thing that we see in Hollywood that suddenly happens all of a sudden. These were things that were precipitous events that were intended to do precisely to maintain the status quo. I also look at the ways in which Bill Clinton's initiative of race and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa both publicly admit that violence and racial violence has been used to maintain specific ways in which the culture was dominated.
I'm interested, you do that, I'm interested in your analysis of the effectiveness of Bishop Tutu's Reconciliation Initiative. I mean, we came to a point where a prime minister who had gone so far to initiate change that brought Mandela to the presidency absolutely refused to cooperate with the Reconciliation Commission.
Right.
What's your take on how effective it was, whether we're any better off after all of those confessions, after all of that pain? For my part, knowing that the Biko case and the exposure of what had happened in that case served to prick consciences, prick the conscience of a national society. I thought that was one effect, but I never identified the word reconciliation with that result. I mean, I thought people were angered, infuriated, distressed, condemned the evil of the system that murdered Biko in jail, but I never identified the word reconciliation.
In that
Is
process.
reconciliation a misnomer there?
Well, it's difficult to decide because part of what was going on was the fact that these people often didn't know exactly what had happened to their loved ones. Can you imagine losing your child or your husband or your mother or someone very close to you and never knowing how they came to be in that situation? And so part of I believe, the Truth and Reconciliation process was that this idea of confession was not only good for the soul, but allowing these families to understand what took place and allowing them to grieve. Because part of the grieving process is at least coming to terms with understanding precisely what took place. And And the negative view of that, though you get the information out on the table, there's a way in which it's very difficult to move beyond if there's no way that people pay for these kinds of things.
There is, yeah. And I don't want to say that revenge drives people, but on the other hand, revenge is a reality. And if you've lost a loved one, you think that the person who was responsible for that death should pay.
Should have some sort of public repayment of the
That's
consequences
right. And
of a crime.
so those, for example, the prison guards who came forward and confessed, yes, I did this, I brutalized this person, I murdered, in effect, I murdered that person. I mean, it's all well and good for that beautiful, benign,
Can we all just get along?
saint-like presence,
Right.
Bishop Tudu,
Right.
saying, you're forgiven, my son. But if I've lost someone, I'm not sure that makes me feel reconciled.
That's going to be enough. But part of it is the public airing of grievance. And indeed, if you look at the way in which Emmett Till's mother made that a very public spectacle, not only his funeral, but in her subsequent conversations about the loss of her son. No one ever really paid for that crime, but getting the information out is a part that perhaps, if you can at least infiltrate the consciousness of one person who would embrace white supremacy in a different way, then perhaps that would be a part of
I have always
the
thought
reconciliation.
that Emmett Till's ordeal, his death, the trial, the exposure of the corruption of the system of justice, I've always thought that helped set the scene for civil rights movement's ability to prick the conscience of the country in a very real way. I mean, if you knew this could happen, if you knew that this was the model of Southern justice, and in so many cases it was, you know, you remembered that when you saw dogs attacking school children, when you saw fire hoses turning black ministers upside down and crushing them into the sidewalk.
And the way in which little Ruby Bridges had to go through that gauntlet of
Exactly.
racial hate.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
But when you make it public and when you make it a national and an international affair, there's some part of that truth that does prick the conscience. And so that's in part what is important about these events, that you remember them in such a way that you can get at the truth that perhaps was covered up a bit in the beginning.
If you had to draw, I mean, in a sense, we've come so far from where we were. In a sense, there is yet so far to go. I mean, when you realize that there is, within the last few years, case in Jasper, Texas, in
Yes.
which a man is literally dragged to death behind a truck. 3 people are convicted, 2 get the death penalty, another life imprisonment as a result of that. I mean, the outcome is quite different than it was in the case of Emmett Till.
There's been a critical social evolution
There has.
in that regard.
And a
but
legal
this-
evolution.
And a legal evolution. The problem with that, though, is that people still have this mindset, that you can still have that mindset of white supremacy even in this day and time. It makes us wonder how indeed this kind of legacy continues.
If you take that case, recently I had on a program on this station producers of a television documentary on that event in
On
Jasper.
Texas, yes.
One producer was an African American, the other was white. They were friends. They went in. And their story is a compelling drama of how a city tried to come together, but still, if you got inside each community, you knew the tension, the stress, the dislike, the hatred
Yes, yes.
remained. And the convictions may have helped some, but racism is still just as alive and as sick
As it
in
was.
some ways as it ever was. But you write about, that reminds me that you write about media depictions of the phenomenon, how it's characterized in film and in the media. Talk a little bit about that.
Okay. Malcolm X once said that the American media can make the American people love and hate at will. And he said this many years before in communications theory. The power of the press was critiqued in that particular way. Indeed, we can see the legacy of some of the power of the press right now in preparation for Al-Qaeda and the connections between Al-Qaeda and other kinds of people in this axis of evil. If you present this information without a historical layer, without a way to see the ways in which these things develop, people just absorb this information. And it becomes a part of their knowledge base without them ever having to think critically about the information they're receiving. And so part of what I wanted to do in this book was to look at media representations of racial violence, beginning back in 1898 and coming up to 2000. And part of what I saw was that the same thing takes place. In 1898 in Wilmington, it was the print media that was in terms of this white racialized mutilation. They were at the center of it. And it was manipulated, the facts were manipulated so that they could develop this sense of impending crisis that precipitated the violence. In the 2000 image that I looked at in terms of South Africa, I dealt with the pre-election violence in one of the Bantustans where the prime minister was not going to allow the people to be a part of the all-race elections. He wanted to remain in power, a black man. To his rescue came the Afrikaner Brotherhood, all white, many of them driving Mercedes and armed to the teeth, to come and defend this black president who wanted to maintain the South African status quo. What happens in our reportage of this event, rather than focusing on this white violence that's at hand, immediately there's a report about it, and the reporter switches to, in other news, there's black-on-black violence in another part of South Africa, without interrogating or critiquing this image of white violence at all. So I think it's critical that we look at the role the press plays, and in fact, its own short-sightedness in maintaining the racial situation.
Well, we've run out of time. Well, for those of you, we've been talking to Shelia Smith Mc Koy about her new book, When Whites Riot. Thank you so much for coming. Thank all of you for joining us. Thank you for watching A Word on Words. I'm John Siegenthaler. Keep reading.